Welcome to Tuesdays for Nurture. I'm your host, Roberto Ochoa. Tuesdays for Nurture is a Tuesday webinar series here in the United Church of Christ, which we faithfully focus on education for the people of God. Topics from faith-filled politics to interviews of key leaders to know-hows in congregational life and the impacts of current realities on the life of the church are featured. And each webinar includes clear suggestions on what you can do to change the church and the world towards the world God imagines us for us today. Today, we're pleased to present a webinar on equity and equality in the movement for racial justice. Racial justice continues to be a concern for African descendant communities globally. The onset of COVID-19 in early March of last year has affected people across the globe. But in the US, people of color, particularly Black people, have been disparately affected, resulting in heightened racial ethnic disparities and inequities. The movements for justice is complex and includes the call for equity and inclusion, issues which are essential to bring changes in church and society. I am proud to introduce to you Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia Thompson, who will present the panel for you today. Good afternoon, Dr. Karen Georgia.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here and to have with me in conversation my friends. Aundreia Alexander and Adele Halliday, both of whom I've worked with pretty closely over the last few years, particularly around the movement for racial justice, not just here in the United States, but globally. Particularly with Adele, who's from the United Church, but I will introduce them in a few minutes. So I'm very excited to have this conversation, particularly in the context of Black History Month. We know that Black history is every month, but we have this one set aside, and so we're going to use it accordingly. So I want to frame my remarks this afternoon by reading a poem that I wrote a few years ago. And after I read the poem, I'm going to introduce our guests and we are going to have conversation, just as if we're sitting on at a cafe, someplace nice and cozy and warm, rather than the places that are a little bit colder today. So this poem is called My Story. This child of kings and queens, this queen, matriarch, this king leader, carrying stories in buckets, waters from deep wells drawn daily to quench my thirst for free. A foretaste of glory I will see. This is my story. This is my song. I am a laborer in the fields, working the land with hands numb, fingers calloused, back bent to the sun, no time to weep. Children cannot eat tears. This is my land. This is my story. This is my song. I am a laborer in the fields, wearing stripes, moving rocks and stones, breaking up fallow ground, chains to my ankles, head bowed low, escaping the whip, punished for aspiring, punished for daring to own myself as human. This is my story. This is my song. I am a laborer in the fields, body sold to toil and till, no longer free, told I am worth less than a horse, more than a mule, talking beast, beaten for thinking, shamed for being me, fighting for purchase on my humanity. This is my story. This is my song. Yesterday was 577 years. Today, 577 years later, I sing the same story. I sing the same song. Wailing for freedom, singing for change, broken bodies, broken promises, 577 years of grave injustices, blessed assurance, justice will be mine. This is my story. This is my song. I am a laborer in the fields. I toil in the heat, sweat on my brow. I smile at the sun, watching the children play, bringing water to pale visitors. I sing, murmuring the discordant beginning of 577 years. This is my story. This Is My Song. Joining me this afternoon are Reverend Aundreia Alexander, Esquire, and she is the Associate General Secretary for Advocacy and Action for Justice and Peace with the National Council of Churches of Christ, National Council of Churches USA. And Aundreia, her job description spans everything from lobbying politicians to proposing legislation, meeting with civil and human rights organizations, and shaping and communicating the council's opinion on various legal and political issues. She was a very close ally, and we worked together on the Act Now to End Racism campaign with the National Council of Churches. And she's also a part of the racial equity campaign in the council. She practiced law with the Missouri Attorney General's office before moving to the East Coast to attend seminary at Princeton. And she also attended the University of Missouri in Columbia. So welcome, Aundreia. It is wonderful to have you and to be able to work with you in this capacity. From the north of where I am, is Adele Halliday. And Adele is the Anti-Racism and Equity Officer for the United Church of Canada. And that is a new position that was created in the General Counsel Office, reporting to their General Secretary. Adele has served in several related positions in the national offices for the United Church of Canada for the past 15 years. So her position is in response to the United Church's commitment to become an anti-racist denomination. And in her role, Adele will help the church live into its commitment, which will take continuous effort, reaching out to all parts of the church, equipping leaders, engaging with anti-racist practices, etc. So I welcome both of them, both leaders in their own right, and women with whom I have actually traveled this globe as we share a common commitment and passion to the movement for justice for people of African descent. So welcome. But folks don't want to hear from me, they want to hear from you. So I want to jump right in, and we're going to have a conversation, because actually we're not strangers with each other. I think the last time we were together, we were in Switzerland. So we've been in places and spaces together. So I want to start with the roles that each of you play in your respective places of employment, because this is work that is the ecumenical movement in the movement for justice. So I want to start with you, Aundreia. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing? And then Adele, if you could follow.
Well, currently what I'm doing is, the National Council of Churches has a history of working on racial justice issues, but it's also both a challenge and a gift that we have this coalition. Our communions, 38 communions, represent our predominantly white mainline denominations: Presbyterian Church USA, United Church of Christ, United Methodist, Lutheran Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and others, but also our historically African American churches, African Methodist Episcopal, AME Zion, the CME, the Christian Methodist Episcopal, and so on. And we have fringe churches and peace churches. And that coming together is both like I said, a gift and a challenge, in that many of those Black churches, quite frankly, broke off as a part of our history because of racism taking place in the very church. And it's a challenge that we've been working on probably since we've been in existence. Currently, part of the ways that we're trying to address that in a way that I hope and believe could be to do some work on real in-depth systemic change is through our Act Now campaign initiative, which you mentioned, and we're greatly a good part of that in our early stages. ACT for the acronym standing for Awaken, Confront, Transform. Awaken, individuals, communities, churches, society to the realities of racism. Dr. King has one of my many favorite quotes, but one is that he says, there's nothing more dangerous in the world than conscientious ignorance and willful stupidity. And so part of the awakening is that this is not new. This is who we are. It is in our DNA. Confronting it, addressing it head on, straight on, seeing it for what it is, and that with God's grace will transform the hearts of individuals, congregations, and society and community at large. All of the work that we do, every policy issue I address, we look at it from a racial equity lens. One of the big things, and I want to remind people and encourage you to tune in tomorrow at 10 o'clock Eastern time, there will be a hearing for HR 40, which is the, and I always get the, I should know the full title, but it's the, we call it the reparations bill, but it's to do a study and actually develop some how-tos in what in the way of reparations. Congressman Conyers presented and proposed this bill for almost 40 years before he died. And there was a hearing last year, but this one is really big. There's already about 170 sign-ons, and we're looking for more. So I'll just stop there regarding some of the things that we're currently working on as a part of our history and our current focus.
And I definitely want us to come back to the conversation about reparatory justice and this question about reparations. Adele, a little bit about your work and some of the things that you're engaged in at this time.
So thanks for the question. So the United Church of Canada has been involved in anti-racism work for decades, many decades. So the work is not new. It happens to be that this staff position is new. Over time, there have been programs, resources, policies created, and yet there's still the reality of systemic racism in the church. And so this position was one that was created to try to work with people across the church to work around dismantling systemic racism in all of its forms: anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, challenging the reality of white supremacist culture and how white privilege manifests itself in the church. So this is one position that's working with people across the church to try to live into this reality. I will say that, of course, anti-racism work is the work of the whole church. It involves all of us to be engaged and involved in the effort. And so the staff role is just one component around that. I think just to name a reality around the Canadian context, in particular, a particular reality for the church and the United Church, is that sometimes the Canadian narrative around racism is either untold or told as a utopic reality. Sometimes it gets rewritten as Canada was the utopic place that was the end of the Underground Railroad. So people went there and people were free. What's often not told is what happened afterwards and the reality of racism that people have experienced and continue to experience, and within the churches. It's also particularly difficult, I think, for people within, particularly the United Church. Almost every time I lead an anti-racism education workshop, people talk about, well, what does racism look like in the church, and specifically in the United Church? People are willing and able to name overt examples of racism in society, examples where they see in politics and other places, but it's very difficult for people to look inward and name, this is what's happening within the church itself. And even as people of faith who love one another, who follow Jesus, we are still a place where systemic inequities exist and continue to exist. So one component of my staff role, as I mentioned, is to work with people across the church to work at dismantling racism in all of its forms. And one component of that is working with one of our national committees to develop what we're calling an anti-racism action plan. So this was going to be it's essentially, some people might call it a strategic plan or strategic directions, but a way in which we're going to name, here are some really key areas that we think we as a church need to be working on for the next few years, and to focus on those areas. So we might name 3 or 4. The plan is still being developed and drafted at the moment. And to say, these are our key areas for focus. This is what we need to be working on collectively, and the church in all of its manifestations. So from our local communities of faith, our general council, our regional council offices, the church in its breadth would need to be working on these issues to continue to move towards becoming a racially just church, to move towards challenging systemic racism. The education programs, all of those are helpful and important, and yet we need more. We've been doing this work for a long time. We need to keep doing it for a long time. So this is one expression of how do we stay in this work for the long haul.
Thank you. I want to follow up on something that you raised, which is the ways in which sometimes people don't know the stories. And I also want to pose this question to Aundreia. How important is it to have a comprehensive narrative? So a way to tell the stories of African descendant communities and the ways in which systemic injustice continues among us, but also the common history that is a part of what has created this in our communities. Adele, I'll start with you, and then Aundreia.
So how is it important for us to tell stories? Maybe I'll share a bit of a personal reflection. Growing up within the church, I often felt like there were elements of stories of people of African descent that were not told. So stories of what is the presence of people of African heritage in the Bible? How do we speak about Afrocentric theologies? These were parts of the story that in my life were not told, and I longed for them to be told. I felt like something was missing. So when we think about a narrative, a story being told, it allows people to see themselves more reflected in our communities of faith and in the broader Christian story. Even broader than that, the narrative, if I'm speaking about the Canadian context, the story that is sometimes told is retold in unhelpful ways. So by telling the story as the Canadian context being this utopic reality, it dismisses the realities of racism that people continue to experience. It doesn't allow space for that story to be told, because what people are understanding is, well, this is such a wonderful place, this multicultural, diverse context where everybody's feeling welcome. How can you possibly be having this experience of racism? That must be about you as an individual. It's much harder for people to understand it as a systemic issue. So the breadth of the story, of all of our stories being told, reflected, it's not only about creating a better place of belonging, but challenging the inequities, I think, that are both in church and society.
I can't add a whole lot to that, but what I will say is that Ibram X. Kendi, the scholar and specialist in this area of racism, had a quote in an article, I think it was last year, where he says that data often tells us things that we didn't know. Racial data tells us what we did not know, and it sometimes reveals or confirms what we already know. And I think that's what our stories do. And getting back to Dr. King's quote about ignorance, the systemic racism in America is so much ingrained in who we are that if we don't have a unified and solidified story, then it gets distorted and co-opted. I had a conversation recently with my niece who works at a university in the medical department. And one of her colleagues, who happened to be a white woman, the woman made a statement and my niece indicated that it had racist undertones. The woman cried. And then she went on to say, she told a story of how a Black woman mentioned that they sent in a Black doctor to talk to her, and the woman says, "You only sent her here because she's Black." And so the white woman was indicating that that was racist. And so understanding the stories and being able to communicate what real racism is, and systemic racism, is extremely important for us to have a unified story and understanding of what racism, what the construct of racism, but its real impact and systemic white supremacy that is so ingrained in who we are as a nation and a people, is extremely important.
The North American reality, which is some of what we're talking about when we have this binational conversation, has a particular context that has some continuities. What you mentioned, Adele, about the road to freedom, if you will, and how that becomes an extension of this story, but it's also a story in and of its own. Of course, also connects with the region in general, because the Caribbean context also flows into this, and the South American and the Central American, the ways in which the Americas becomes a part of this narrative. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit, to talk a little bit more about this global context. Because in these days of pandemics, right, and particularly as COVID-19 has continued to move around the globe, one of the fault lines that we continue to see is the ways in which particularly African descendant communities, but definitely marginalized communities globally, are affected. So can you speak a little bit to this particular moment? And what we have seen, both in the US context, the Canadian context, around COVID, and the particular brand of racism that is evidenced in the health disparities that we see. Aundreia.
When COVID first hit, and even more so now that we're seeing even the disparity in access to the vaccine in so many ways. In fact, the quote that I'm attributed to Ibram X. Kendi came after, as COVID was unveiling so many of our disparities. It highlighted none of the best of who we are, but pretty much the worst of who we are as a nation on so many levels. There's education disparity, access to healthcare, who was what I called essential versus disposable staff and employees. We have those stories where, predominantly, mostly immigrants who were working in plants that basically found ways to opt out of even caring for their staff. There was so much emphasis and important for sure on first responders, doctors, nurses, but we all know that a hospital, a healthcare facility does not run without the cleaning staff. The orderlies and all of those various things. So COVID just unveiled so much of our brokenness in so many different areas of how we exist every day in society just to live. So, I mean, even things like I am financially capable of ordering my groceries. Everybody can't do that. Access to, because you pay extra to do that. Access for young people who have to stay home in schools. What those people that we just talked about, the orderlies and help certain levels of access, those who are providing necessary roles within our hospitals, they can't stay home with their kids. And even if they are at home, or they qualified and capable of homeschooling, which is basically what we've gone to, even with your teachers online? Do they have computers? Do they have access to the internet? It's just so many things. And then if there is something good to come out of this horrible pandemic, hopefully it will be an understanding of how those disparities are really genuine and for real and true, which is something that many of us already knew, but it just put a bright spotlight on it. And many people continue to try to turn their heads. We in America have a way and tendency to want to compartmentalize and try to do this, but not that. In the racial inequity, we've attempted to do things like mass incarceration, but not address the racial inequities. We've attempted to talk about healthcare, but not talk about the racial inequities. We want to deal with healthcare, but we don't want to talk about the issues of racial inequities. So the intersectionality of the issues, as well as our profile as people, it's different for women. It's going to be different for Black people. It's going to be different for brown people, for Native Americans, in ways that it's not the same for our white Americans, and not just, they're white poor people, so it just really highlighted and showed all of the intersectionalities of these inequities.
Thanks. So I wonder if I can pick up there. I completely agree. It very much exposed already existing inequities that were there. And very tangibly in the context where I live in Toronto, when they started to collect race-based data, so data based on race, they quickly discovered how clear those inequities were. So, for example, in one case recently, they found that Black people and people of color make up 83% of reported COVID cases in Toronto. 83%. Just proportion-wise, Black people, for example, are at that time were 21% of the reported cases, but are only 9% of the population. So there's an inequity here. But people were not necessarily asking the questions, well, why is that the case? It's some of what our colleague Aundreia was just talking about, the issues of the intersections of class, of race, of everything else that people were not wrestling with. When we think about the ability to work from home or self-isolate at home, people who are essential workers who had to leave home, again, many are racialized. Many are working jobs which don't allow people to be from home or to self-isolate. And those intersections and those connections were not necessarily being made clear. So the reality of who is disproportionately affected and who is getting COVID is racialized. On the flip side, now that there are vaccines available, there's an additional question now about vaccine equity. What does that mean, and what does that look like? So again, speaking from the context where I am in Toronto, Toronto has just launched essentially a task force to look at how do we respond to issues facing the Black community around COVID-19, and recognizing that there's particular vaccine hesitancy, which is different from anti-vaxxers. So there's vaccine hesitancy that's based in historic experiences and inequitable access to healthcare. So, for example, the Tuskegee experiment, which experimented on Black lives and Black people's experiences by intentionally and deliberately allowing people to be sick so that they could be subjects of experiments. That's part of our collective history as Black peoples. So when there's a new vaccine that comes out, people are hesitant about that. Is that really going to help us? Is that really going to be for us? Which is a different question from being against vaccines as a whole. There's a health inequity here. And I hope you understand what I'm saying here. That there's a difference. People have a different experience in the healthcare system. And that makes people hesitant about responding. Even in terms of when Black people go to the doctor or try to access healthcare, how that's understood and received is sometimes different. There are sometimes doctors and healthcare professionals who have talked about how they believe that Black people have a higher threshold for pain, so will not necessarily respond in the same way that people of other racial backgrounds will. So there's, on one side, the conversation about who is affected by COVID-19, who is disproportionately exposed. Then on the other side, this question around vaccine equity and how to respond in particular to some of the concerns from people in the Black community who have historic experiences that are rooted in systemic racism.
And I want to just follow up on Adele's statement, because I don't know if you all are having this issue in Canada. There has been an attempt to make the vaccine more readily available to those communities that are impacted in a more disparate manner. And what we're finding is that in some cases, in many cases, you actually have white people going into Black communities to get those vaccines. And so again, white supremacy kind of rears up, even in cases like this. And so that's been an issue for us here.
One of the things that is already evident, if those who are listening and watching haven't already picked up on, is that there are commonalities in our experiences across the geographic border for persons of color, which is, and for Black communities, which is a part of this conversation. So I have a follow-up for you both in this question of equity, because health equity is a particular issue, but equity in and of itself becomes a part of the conversation around reparatory justice. And Aundreia had kind of led in her statements, talking a little bit about the movement for reparations, right? So I want to ask you, again, from your perspectives, what are your thoughts about the movement for equity, and what does it mean in each of your contexts when we talk about the movement for equity, and how does that tie in with the idea of reparatory justice? Yeah, Aundreia, you could go, and then, yeah.
Okay. I think that we are never going to get to, it is the beginning of the whatever people want to consider a healing process. I want to quote someone who I really admire, Reverend Dr. Georgia Thompson, who was on one of our panels for the Christian Unity Gathering. And when people talk about reparations, and it's not just white people, there's this way that the first thought is, who has to give up what? What's going to be the sacrifice? And her response was, how about if we begin to think of what we gain? What do you gain? And think about it, especially as Christian people. If everyone is accessed, if justice is the ultimate outcome, then it's good for everybody. Fannie Lou Hamer, who is, I sometimes have to just hear her voice sometimes. I mean, she's my shero, and she says, if I ain't free, ain't none of us free. In other words, our freedom is tied up into one another. And so until we get to a point of actually getting to some understanding of what our true, that goes back to storytelling and so forth, we cannot get to any repairing without justice being the ultimate end. And the HR 40 bill also requires that there's a gathering of the resources and information and study. I know some people are like, it's been studied, we already know, but it is not in the record. The United States has never had an official, even apology. And at this point, we definitely don't want a "we sorry, but," kind of thing. So we have to get to to have it in the record. It would also be foundational for education. We just had this situation here. I don't know if you're familiar with this, Adele, but in the United States, the previous presidential administration, on their way out the door, proposed a document called a 1776 report. I didn't read it. I'll be honest with you. I wasn't trying to go there. But my understanding is basically what they did, which is part, again, of our history. Right after the Civil War, we have been fighting the Civil War since the Civil War. The Daughters of the Revolution they took over our educational system. And there are some places now that will not even, you can go all of your entire educational school system up through high school and graduate and get like a Black History Month where you identify certain people, but never know the history, our true history about slavery, how we took land for Native Americans, and a whole basically any of our history that does not tell the story of who we are as a nation. And so that's my understanding. You have to get to the core. You have to get to the truth. And I call it, at this point, I'm calling it a radical prophetic truth-telling season.
Adele.
Great, thanks. So as we think about equity and as it relates to reparations, I wonder if maybe I can first distinguish between equality and equities. That's a conversation that's come up.
Yes, thank you.
When we think about equality, that's about everybody being the same, everybody being treated exactly the same, no matter what your circumstances. So if you think about, I mean, we are people who love food. If we think about food, it would mean that no matter what your dietary restrictions are, you would receive the exact same dinner. So you could have a dinner table with someone who's diabetic, someone who's gluten-free, you could have an infant, you could have someone who's a vegetarian, and you would all receive a steak dinner. We would say that's completely ridiculous. People aren't going to be fed. Not everyone can eat that. You would, in reality, if you're doing that, you would actually think about providing different meals for different people. That's the equity question. What do people need and how do you provide it for them so that it reaches the end goal? If the end goal is for people to be fed, provide people meals that allows them to do that. If our goal in society is to provide an equal access that allows people to participate fully in society, what are people's particular needs that are going to help us get there? It's not going to be by treating everybody equally, because not everybody has the same starting place. Not everybody has the same needs. There are systemic barriers that are preventing people from fully participating in society. The equity question gets at that, what are those systemic barriers and how do we work at dismantling them? It's not about treating people the same. It's about recognizing people are different and have different needs and responding to that. I think sometimes we as church struggle with the equality equity question. We want everybody to be treated the same. But in order to have a more fair outcome, in order for people to be actually treated the same, in the end, people's responses cannot be the same. So I hope that makes sense. In terms of the reparation question then, it also recognizes that people are not coming from the same starting point. So Aundreia also referenced the reality of slavery. When slavery was coming to an end, it did not end the same way for everybody. Some people who were white were given land and tools and resources and capital and ways of helping to make things move forward for them. People who were African descendants were given freedom, maybe, but not much else. The starting place is not the same. When you think about that generations later, what does that mean for the realities of people who are descendants? People have had to overcome different kind of obstacles to try to end up in the same place. And that's just the generations, never mind the other barriers that are already in place. We've talked about the reality of systemic racism. So all of these barriers are in place. So we cannot treat everybody the same. And the reparation question gets us back to that. Sometimes when we think about reparations, people go to the money question. People say, well, it's only about money, and that is a component. But we've talked about here that a component of that can mean an apology. It can mean moving towards right relationships. How do we repair the relationship? How do we look to that historical reality of that generational legacy and do things differently? So for me, this reparation question is wrapped up in the question of equity, equitable access, and how do we ask different kinds of questions that allow people to participate a little more fully in society?
Thank you. So where our time, believe it or not, is starting to wind down. I do want to bring some attention to some of what has been asked in the chat. And actually address a couple of things. But one of the things that I want to name is in terms of reparations. When we talk about reparations, that it's not just about money, which Adele said. So one of the things that I would invite you to look at in terms of a reparations plan is the 10-point reparations plan that the Caribbean community put together. And it's Caricom, CARICOM, reparations plan. I know that some of us are on YouTube, so I just want to spell that out because the chat is not there. And what some of these reparations plans are actually talking about are not just money, giving money to people. In fact, none of them are talking about giving money to people. It's really talking about this equity question. How do you level the playing field? It's about building infrastructure. It's about community development. It's about knowledge recovery. And there's also a question here which says, is it atypical for our African diaspora / Black story to be told, given our heritage of griots, oral transmissions throughout? How do we recover our own storytelling? And that is also a part of this knowledge culture, being able to recover stories, being able to tell the stories which have in some cases been erased or rewritten. So, and also, what does it mean for us as people, as African descendant people, to have heritage and culture that is often far removed from who we are and how we understand ourselves to be? So there's that question too about identity. So I want to ask this question, and Adele, there's a question in the chat about the 4 major areas that you're going to address systemic racism in the United Church of Canada. The glorious UCC is used, which is always a wonderful thing, but that's a question for you. But I just want to ask this question as you're preparing yourself, Adele, when we circle back to answer that question. As we talk about reparations, there are also conversations about reconciliation, which is a big question, and notions of forgiveness and generational trauma and all these kinds of things. What would you say is the role of the church? And when we're talking about the church here, we're talking about Christian faith communities. In the US, Canada, globally. What, in your opinion, is the role of the churches in providing leadership in the fight against anti-Black racism and all those manifestations, as well as in the conversation around reparations and reconciliation? Adele, let's start with you.
Okay. So maybe I'll name the four main areas first, and then I'll move into the role of the churches. So the 4 main areas are still being developed. The plan is still being drafted, so it's not yet finished. The hope is that it'll be finished in maybe by September or so of this year. So maybe when it's done, we can circle that back and share that more widely. So the 4 main areas, not yet, in progress. In terms of the role of churches, for me, this is essential. I believe churches have a prophetic call to respond to racial injustice. We absolutely have to. It is part of our faith, part of our call. People are literally dying because of racism. People are dying. And we, as people of faith, are called to respond to that. We are people who, Jesus talks about life in its abundance. Racism does not allow for that. And so I believe we are doing a great injustice when we ignore the reality of racism. So that means that people from in local congregations, people across the church, have ways to be involved in challenging racism in all of its forms. So absolutely the role of churches. I'll just name one component of the United Church's anti-racism policy. There are four parts of it. But one part names speaking to the world. So it's not just about speaking to the church, but how do we speak out to what's the reality that's happening in society beyond the walls of the church itself. For me, though, to do that with authenticity, it also requires churches to do the internal work of what's happening within the churches themselves. So how do we look at what's happening? What does racism look like within the church? How do we work on that? What does racism look like outside of the church? How are we speaking, and what does that look like? I've been involved in community conversations about anti-racism, anti-Black racism, and broader forms of racism. And churches have been absent. There have been places where I've been involved in advocacy, and I might be there as an individual, not necessarily representing the church, but there can be nobody else. There are times where there's nobody else there from churches. I think there are times where we have missed opportunities to speak prophetically when we can. It's part of who we are. It's part of our call. So for me, the role of churches in working towards dismantling racism in all of its forms is absolutely essential, and it's part of our call.
Thank you, Aundreia.
Again, ditto to everything Adele said. But I also think that there's this way, again, as she said, the thing about churches and that's a difficult one too. There's been, again, the co-opting of, I shouldn't say co-opting, but different interpretations of what Christianity means, different interpretations of church. So it is very broad. And for our conversations, we will say faith communities that identify as Jesus Christ as, their head. And that may, again, manifest itself in various ways. But the authenticity in order to do this with authenticity, I think is very important. And I really appreciate that. And that's part of what I was not saying and intending when I talked about the challenge and gift of our communions that have come together with these churches that have this history that is fraught with challenge. But we can now come together and to be very, very churchy under the umbrella of our faith in Jesus Christ and hold each other accountable under that umbrella, but acknowledging also within our churches, within our denominations, acknowledging that there is racism and white supremacy ingrained in our symbols, our biblical interpretations, our ecclesiastical processes that we have not acknowledged. Again, we'll say that it's all fair and equal when you have to follow this process, but realizing that there are those of us that come from different backgrounds, traditions, ethnicities, that doesn't fit for us. And it's not, and so when people say we're going to use these neutral standards, that is one of the biggest dangers when it comes to equality or equity, even equality or equity, but definitely in equity, when we're going to use what we call quote unquote merits. We talk about who defines and determines what are the merits, who defines and determines what these processes should be, and why one over the other is more important or significant. So that does a lot, but that internal work, the internal work is extremely important. And so many of our, it's kind of the difference between, I have all kinds of UCC swag, and I don't have this one out here, but one of the t-shirts that I really appreciate is the one that talks about, basically from ally to comrade. I mean, so there are people who will say that in churches that want to talk about racism, and they want to do the they and the them, but cannot find their way to address what's happening under their own stained glass windows, and in their own individual hearts and out of their own pulpits. And so that's extremely important for us to do this work, and to have any real impact.
Thank you both so much. I actually had one last question, but I think we're almost out of time. So I'm gonna invite you briefly, very, very briefly, and this is not a fair question to put out there, to be brief. What do you see as the most challenging issue for the movement at this time globally?
White fear.
Okay. Adele?
Maybe ditto that. Yeah, ditto that. And maybe just individuality. Just a quick note that many of us who are involved in this work are not doing it as individuals. We are building on the work of people who have gone before us and people who will go after us. This is the long haul. So I think the challenge is, the thinking that we're doing it on our own. We're not. We're guided by the Spirit. We are accompanied by many people who've gone before us and done this work, often at great self-sacrifice to themselves, both staff and people in communities. So maybe the thinking that that people are doing this as individuals. We're never alone. We're part of a much broader community. And I always give thanks for those who have done this work before and those who will do the work after.
Thank you so much. Your contributions to the conversation today really show why we need to be in conversations, not just with ourselves here in the United States, or in Canada, but really having these international conversations that begin to open up and show the commonalities and the ways in which we need to do our work. So thank you both. We are going to close out our time at this moment. So thank you. And I did put contact information in the chat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karen Georgia. Thank you, Reverend Aundreia and Ms. Adele, for your impactful and very important conversation. Please stay with us as Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia will close this program with a benediction. And thank you so very much. On behalf of the Justice and Local Church Ministries of the United Church of Christ, we are so grateful to support ministries like this. Would you consider texting UCC to 41444 to donate to the annual fund? It is support from you that allows the UCC to continue producing important digital programs, such as today's very important conversation on racial justice. We have some upcoming events. This coming Friday on February 19th, who and what is hurting our poor and low-income siblings? We will be having a webinar on the state of the poor. Join Reverend Dr. William Barber, the president and senior lecturers of Repairs of the Breach and co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, and Reverend Tracy Blackman, UCC Associate General Minister, as they address the state of the poor in America 2021. And on next Tuesday, on February 23rd, we will continue the conversation on church-based reparations. There is a growing call among many U.S. religious groups to explore financial reparations as part of amends through financial investments and long-term programs benefited African Americans. So the United Church of Christ General Minister and Reverend and President, the Reverend Dr. John Dorhauer, will lead an ecumenical panel discussion of representatives of various predominantly Euro-descendant congregations to explore the theological grounding for reparations, and will share learnings, mistakes, suggestions for next steps, and practice for engaging the work. Again, thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I invite Reverend Dr. Karen Georgia.
Thank you. So the benediction this afternoon is a poem, and it's called Complicit. Measure the silence and beats of compassion. How long before you speak? The world needs your voice to speak while others weep. Silence is for those who sleep. Measure the silence in the breaths between their screams. How long before you hear the sounds of hearts breaking in despair and defeat? Silence is for those who don't care. Measure the silence in the depths of their teardrops. Another child dies in her mother's arm. Hunger gnaws at their bellies, no food for miles. Silence is for those spewing bile. Measure the silence in the heartbeats of the hopeless. Cry because you must. Grasping at peace, no need for despair. Silence is for those who won't hear. Measure the silence in the syllables of repackaged truth. The system is abusive, justice is elusive. Scream your truth. Run from hate and fear. Silence is for those who are living dead. May we go in peace and be blessed. Amen.
Thank you very much.
Siblings in Christ, if you are moved by this conversation, if what's been offered here has helped enhance your ministry or has nurtured your soul for the journey, please consider donating to the annual fund of the United Church of Christ by texting UCC to 41444. Your support will help to provide programs like this, which are an essential part of our ministries in the United Church of Christ. Thank you for your support. Be blessed on your journey and know that you are not alone. We are holding you in prayer. Amen.